Cyberpunk 2077 was one of the most anticipated games of recent years. Everyone was excited to get their hands on the game as the hype grew more and more as the months passed. The game was set to release on April 16th, 2020, but then it got delayed, and then again, and then again. Finally, on December 10th, 2020, CD Projekt Red's Cyberpunk 2077 was released to gamers worldwide, and it was a fucking shit show. The game was released, and with it came a plethora of bugs and glitches, especially on last-gen consoles. I won't get into them, as you can just go onto r/Cyberpunk 2077 subreddit and you can see for yourself. What has followed these bugs and glitches is massive outrage and disappointment towards CD Projekt Red for selling people what is essentially a broken product for most. Alongside the outrage towards the bugs and glitches came criticisms of the game's gameplay, story, AI, world, and pretty much everything else about the game. I think that most of these criticisms are due to outrage and can be disputed. That's exactly what I'm going to do in this video. As a disclaimer, I will not be defending every single thing about Cyberpunk 2077. The game is, in my opinion, a fucking fantastic game. However, no game is without flaws. The most obvious part is the bugs and glitches. I was fortunate enough to have a relatively glitchless experience. The most notable glitches that I experienced were objects floating in midair, clipping issues, cars spawning on top of other cars, and some characters' dialogues not triggering. The worst glitch I got was the side quest not allowing me to hack an object that needed to be hacked in order to advance in my first playthrough. It pissed me off, but ultimately I just moved on. I should also add that I am on PC, so my game is thankfully more polished than last gen or even current gen consoles. The performance was also pretty bad on release day. I have a Ryzen 5 3600, 2070 Super, and 16 gigs of RAM at 3200 MHz, and I was struggling to run the game at 60 FPS, no matter what settings I had enabled. When they dropped the hotfix, however, I managed to achieve around 60 to 100 FPS depending on what was going on in the game. Current gen consoles were lucky enough to be able to run the game at around 60 FPS consistently from what I have seen. And everyone knows how performance on last gen was. Also, I am not defending CD Projekt Red's handling of the game as it was released. It is extremely scummy and dishonest of them to not allow reviewers to show gameplay of Cyberpunk on last gen consoles. CD Projekt Red is regarded as one of the most, if not the most, consumer-friendly gaming company. We expected better, plain and simple, and it's obvious that they betrayed everyone's trust to some degree, even mine. Everyone has a right to an opinion about this game. Very few games are ever objectively considered good to everyone. I'm not making this video to invalidate anyone's experience playing this game or anyone's critique of this game. CD Projekt Red can use everyone's criticisms of this game, positive and negative, to improve on not only any Cyberpunk DLC, but also any sequel or other CD Projekt Red games that may come in the future. I am, however, going to criticize these criticisms, not for my own opinions on the game and its criticism. One of the biggest criticisms I see about the game is that the AI within the city is inferior to the AI within the worlds of GTA and Red Dead Redemption 2. I will get into the AI in a moment, but first I must address the comparisons to GTA and Red Dead Redemption. I believe comparing Cyberpunk's AI to GTA and Red Dead Redemption is irrelevant for lack of a better word. Let me explain. Rockstar is known for making legendary games that provide extreme attention to detail. That fact is indisputable. I believe that every game company should strive to put an extreme amount of detail in their games. It shows that they appreciate the little things. However, in the grand scheme of things, they don't matter, and it is also unfair to compare Cyberpunk to these games. In Red Dead Redemption 2, you could pick out some random NPC in a town and follow them for a whole day and witness them act out an entire day's worth of chores and errands. This is an amazing feat and shows extreme attention to detail, but how much does it really matter? Not a whole lot. I haven't talked to anyone who decided to stop whatever they were doing to follow an NPC for a whole in-game day, nor have I ever even thought to do it myself. Also, this was more than likely able to be achieved because the max populations in those towns probably only ever hit 17? Outside of the towns were nothing but the rest of the Wild West, and aside from a few random encounters and coming across the occasional NPC on a horse or carriage or something, it was pretty barren. Night City is also an extremely dense city, housing a great deal of people within it. Also, it simply wouldn't add anything to this game. For this type of game, it makes more sense to focus on quantity rather than quality. Not saying that quality isn't important, by the way. The AI can be pretty dumb, don't get me wrong. However, in terms of complexity and attention to detail, it makes sense for CD Projekt Red to focus more on the number of AI instead of the complexity, as a barren city with smart AI would seem lonely and unrealistic given the setting of Cyberpunk. The same goes for GTA. Imagine if there weren't many NPCs within Los Santos, but instead every NPC had chores and errands they had to do every day. Yeah, that's pretty fucking cool. But if driving through downtown Los Santos is more like a drive through a barren city, I can imagine the city wouldn't feel nearly as alive and bustling. Cyberpunk has RPG elements, crafting, looting, leveling up, builds, while GTA has none of that, and if I recall correctly, Red Dead Redemption 2 has the most basic of these features, if any at all. Cyberpunk is not a third-person sandbox game, it's a first-person story-driven RPG. The main purpose of the game isn't to allow you to do whatever you want in an open-world sandbox, it's to tell you an engaging story. I can understand where the reason for the comparison stem from, and in fact being compared to two of some of the greatest games of our generation is a good thing. However, I believe Cyberpunk is being compared to the wrong games. What game would prove a better comparison? The Witcher 3. The Witcher 3 is considered one of the best games of not just its year, but also all time. Gameplay wise, The Witcher and Cyberpunk are actually pretty identical. The way they handle the inventory system is similar. There are rarities on weapons and armor in both games. There is also a lack of a transmog system. The failure to include such a system is annoying. However, I would argue that it matters much less considering you rarely ever see your character in Cyberpunk. In The Witcher 3, you always see Geralt. I found myself wanting a transmog system more in that game than I ever did in Cyberpunk. There is crafting of weapons, armor, mods, and potions in The Witcher 3, similar to the crafting of weapons, armor, mods, and consumables in Cyberpunk. There is a lack of side activities outside of racing at Gwent in The Witcher. You can't go to a tavern and start dancing with the locals just like you can't go to a nightclub and start dancing with some other random people. Even the dialogue system is similar. Choices that advance the conversation are coded as yellow in both games, and choices that are optional are coded as white in The Witcher and blue in Cyberpunk. There have even been players who criticize how a dialogue system in Cyberpunk being color-coded takes away from the experience, although in The Witcher it's the exact same deal. I've even seen comparisons of the dialogue to Fallout 4, which is just plain disrespectful. Another comparison I've seen, which I feel is a fairly moot point, is the lack of customization after character creation. Although I do agree that the lack of character customization is indeed quite odd, I found myself honestly not caring as much. The game is in first person. Outside the beginning of the game, a couple flashes of the character while doing Pan-Am side quests, and the very ending of the game, and any time you enter the inventory menu, you will never see your character unless you choose to do so. The mission structure is the same, main quests which advance the plot, side quests which have their own mini stories and can tie into the main story, and just straight money making jobs which are gigs in Cyberpunk, and The Witcher contracts in The Witcher. Might I add that even in the money making missions from time to time, CD Projekt Red adds a feeling of realness to these missions, so to speak, with the interactions to NPCs that you can have. The combat is, obviously, very different, but the combat in The Witcher is actually worse than the combat in Cyberpunk. On normal difficulty, you can pretty much get by just from spamming dodge, lat attack, and Quen in The Witcher. I never found myself really needing to switch up my approach to fights in that game. In Cyberpunk, the weapons feel weighty, and it feels extremely satisfying to gun down somebody with an SMG, or to take their head off from point blank with a revolver, or from a distance with a sniper rifle. Cyberpunk and The Witcher are actually two very similar games. Many people noted how the gameplay in The Witcher is the weakest aspect. Whether you believe the similarities are due to laziness or that CD Projekt Red's design philosophy is flawed in both titles is entirely up to you, considering the main gripe that people have with The Witcher seems to be both the lackluster AI and the gameplay itself. Since I'm on the topic of comparisons, it'd be beneficial to find other games to compare and contrast Cyberpunk to. Let's compare Cyberpunk to other games of the same formula, Skyrim and Fallout. In Skyrim, no one complained about not being able to sit down and enjoy a cup of mead, nor did anyone complain about not being able to dance whenever a bard played a song on their lute. People didn't really complain that hitting characters with swords felt like you were just slicing the air. Skyrim was praised for its role-playing aspect, feeling as if your choices mattered when you made them, and its quests, and its storyline, its characters, all of which is similar to the structure of Cyberpunk's formula. No one complained about not being able to sit down and enjoy an irradiated squirrel on a stick, or dance in a rundown pub to old 50s music. In all Fallouts, from 3 and up, they follow the same formula. I feel like it is arguable that the AI in those games are just as shit as they are in Cyberpunk, including The Witcher. But as a person whose favorite genre of video games are RPGs, I am accustomed to these types of formulas. Formulas that focus more on the world building through dialogue with characters that are carefully crafted. Formulas that focus more on the main story and side stories that the devs sprinkle throughout the world. NPCs are similar to strangers in real life. They're just there, passing you by, adding a feeling of livelihood. I don't have time to pull over and psychoanalyze every NPC that walks the street of NC. I do agree, however, that there are improvements that can be made to the AI, such as them actually doing something when I rip them out of a vehicle instead of sitting there cowering, or not having every single NPC in the area run away whenever I accidentally hit the curb, on top of not having the fucking cops spawn behind me. At the end of the day, Cyberpunk is an RPG. Even if CD Projekt Red advertises it as an action-adventure game, it has the same RPG formulas as other RPG games that are similar to it. and even CD Projekt Red's golden child, The Witcher 3. It's absolutely crazy for people to expect a Cyberpunk themed GTA/Red Dead Redemption 2 that had attention to detail towards everything and allowed you to live a second life in a Cyberpunk themed world. So that begs the question, why the hell did people expect so much from this game? That could be answered with one simple word: overhype. And just whose fault is it that the game was overhyped? Keanu Reeves, of course. But in all seriousness, it's both CD Projekt Red's and the consumer's fault. People go into an RPG expecting GTA in a Cyberpunk setting, of course they're going to be upset. That's on both CD Projekt Red and the consumer. I will admit that I did not follow much of the marketing that CD Projekt Red did for Cyberpunk. The most I looked at was a few trailers, that 1 hour gameplay reveal, and maybe like the first Night Sea Wire episode, so I don't exactly remember what they talked about that would be in the game. I will admit that my expectations for the game were high, however I did not expect a Cyberpunk themed GTA. I do know, however, that there are a few things that were cut from the final game. It's CD Projekt Red's fault for hyping up a game that obviously was barely even finished, and might as well have not even been released for last-gen consoles. It should have been more open with the development process, and also attempted to not hype too much of the game to consumers because that skews expectations if they can't deliver. It is also safe to assume that most of the player base is on last-gen consoles, considering how difficult it is to obtain a next-gen console and not overpriced PC parts, not to mention the fact that I don't think the vast majority of gamers are on PC in the first place. So a majority of the player base is pissed about the shit performance and likely are looking for other reasons to dislike the game, not to mention that it's trendy to hate on things just for the hell of it, which could very well be the reason as to why this game is getting so much hate. The overhype is also the consumer's fault in the sense that they should not have expected to be able to sim real life in this game. This is a game, not a Cyberpunk life sim. It is unrealistic for CD Projekt Red to allow you to do damn near everything in life in this game. Think of CD Projekt Red's game design philosophy from the Witcher series. They focus on story and characters, not complete immersion to the life of someone within their games. The immersion comes from connecting the characters and making you feel as if you are part of the story, as if Geralt's or V's story is your story. This game was never made with the intention of wowing anyone, similar to how GTA or Red Dead Redemption 2 did. It was made to tell an interesting, intense story with greatly written side characters in the Cyberpunk universe.